As often happens in the remote wilderness area of Crested Butte, Colorado, a storm can appear unexpected, often stranding hikers. It was that way in August 2000. As darkness begins to settle in, the hikers realize they must camp for the night. Later that night, something invades their camp. What did the hikers see that night? Was it a bear looking for food? Or was it something much more mysterious? Could they have seen the legendary beast called Bigfoot?
For thousands of years, there have been reports of huge, hairy beasts from various parts of the world. Some of these animals have been very human-like in shape, but are not human because of their stature, the way they move, and their huge size. What they are remains a mystery.
In this modern age of big city and urban sprawl, it's difficult for people to believe that vast wilderness areas still do exist. Many of these remote areas are virtually untouched by man. With this in mind, it's not difficult to believe that a creature could exist and could have gone undetected for all these years.
Thousands of strange footprints and eyewitness sightings have added to the mystery of this legendary beast. But are these genuine clues that point to the existence of a monster? Or are they simply fabrications that have provided unscrupulous people with the means of perpetuating an elaborate hoax?
We all go through life accepting what textbooks told us about the universe. But what happens when questions are raised about many of our fundamental beliefs? A mystery that cannot be explained. An enigma that defies reason. A surprising and unexpected answer. To encounter such a mystery firsthand may change your life forever. Face to face with the greatest riddles of the ages, the world's most profound mysteries reach out and touch your life in ways you've never imagined possible. Encounters with the Unexplained.
Among Native Americans, there is an ancient legend that has been handed down through many generations. It speaks of a race of giant creatures that the Indians called Sasquatch, which translated means hairy man. But to most of us, the creature is known as Bigfoot.
In the late 19th century, when white settlers were arriving in the far west, they encountered Native Americans who had stories of huge man-like creatures who lived in the mountains. The Native people were afraid of these animals or creatures because they apparently came down and stole women and children as they slept. In April of 1840, Reverend Elkanah Walker was working with the Spokane tribe, working as a missionary. He was concerned, however, because he found them to be rather superstitious. This was based on the stories he was hearing about huge human-like creatures which came down from the mountains, threw stones at the houses, had a terrible smell, and which were stealing salmon from the nets, which they ate raw. They also reported 1.5 foot long tracks.
Were the Indians merely being superstitious? Or had they actually seen something in the woods? The details contained in Reverend Walker's letter are especially interesting when compared with the story of a Bigfoot encounter that happened 80 years later. One of the most famous stories of a Bigfoot encounter happened in the summer of 1924 in the rugged forest near Mount St. Helens. Having seen large unidentifiable tracks in the forest before, the men were on their guard, but nothing could prepare them for what was about to happen.
What's that?
The creature had been hit, perhaps even killed, but the miners didn't take the time to find out. Upon reaching their cabin, the men prepared for some much-needed rest. But Sasquatch had other plans. The men were under attack, and whatever was lurking in the darkness seemed to be out for revenge. The attacks continued throughout the night, with the prospectors using their guns to hold the attackers at bay. When morning finally came, the miners made their escape down the mountain. Frightened but thankful to be alive, the men told a local newspaper reporter that huge gorilla-like animals had attacked them. The creatures, they said, were covered in long black hair, and the tracks they left behind were 14 inches long. Throughout their lives, the miners never wavered from their harrowing tale. But is this story true? If so, what kind of animal would be capable of carrying out such an attack?
There are many thousands of reports of people who claim to have seen the Sasquatches. Most of these are very consistent, and I'm inclined to believe that people are seeing a perfectly real wild animal. Sasquatch appears to be a bipedal animal walking on two legs in a human manner, but with the body usually tilted a little forward at the hips. The body size ranges from about 6 to perhaps 9 feet in height. Body weight of an adult is anywhere from 500 to 800 pounds or a little bit more. The Sasquatch is always described as being covered with hair, perhaps 2 to 4 inches long. Color is usually very dark brown or black, and very rarely reddish or other lighter colors have been reported. The appearance of the arms hanging down to the knees is not because the arms are any longer down, but the way it walks, raising its knees very high. There are a few interesting things about the Sasquatch face. It's more human than ape in the sense that the mouth does not protrude like a gorilla. The nose is relatively flat and wide. The brow ridges are very prominent, and above that the forehead is very retreating, and that's an ape-like characteristic. What's also interesting is that if I stand or hold myself in a normal posture, my mouth and chin are above the level of my shoulders. That's a standard human. Apes, however, have the shoulders up like this, and the mouth is below the level of the shoulders. The same is true of the Sasquatch. So if a Sasquatch wants to turn his head, he can only go so far before he runs into his shoulders. And like the apes, they either tip their head back to look, or they twist the entire body to look. A lot of the eyewitness reports often include a description of an extremely foul odor that's associated with them. And on rare instances, there is a description of an extremely loud, screaming, howling sound that they make.
Part of the problem we've had in proving that this creature is real is that scientists are confronted with a description of a creature which does not line up with any of the known North American game animals or big game animals. What it does line up with is great apes or humans, or even worse, something in between, and scientists as a rule have been very unwilling to entertain this possibility.
Now, just because the Sasquatch sounds like a very unusual, unexpected, and unreal animal, that should not constitute any solid evidence against it. Just imagine you describe to someone who's never heard of the animal a creature that stands maybe 16 feet tall. Half of that is neck, and you get a little incredulous response. Then you add, just for good measure, that it's got 2 fur-covered horns on the top of its head, round balls on the tips, and you've lost all credibility. But that's just what a giraffe looks like. Now, imagine trying to tell the same skeptic about an elephant.
There are plenty of examples of people who have discovered unknown species of animals. They've been laughed at and even called frauds. A perfect example of that is the duck-billed platypus when it was brought back from Australia. And the scientists, even though they had a carcass right in front of them, they thought it was a fake. They couldn't believe their eyes. It was just too fantastic to be true.
If the creature we call Bigfoot really does exist, is it a monster, as some have said, or an unidentified animal that means us no harm? Listen to the eyewitness account of a man named Billy Riley, and you be the judge.
I was just a teenager the night I came face to face with Bigfoot, and it changed my life forever. It was the summer of 1972. My friend and I had gone to his girlfriend's house just outside of town. It turned out to be pretty boring. At least I thought so. So I left him there, and I just started walking back down the main road to the highway. I could hear the cows out across the field. They were carrying on so much, I looked over to see what was happening. I saw what I figured to be a farmer chasing the cows, and I thought that was strange, it being so late in the evening. Then I heard a sound like nothing I'd ever heard before in my life. And I suddenly realized that's no farmer. I could hardly believe my eyes. This huge thing was coming right at me. It must have been more than 10 feet tall, and it was covered with reddish brown hair. I knew I had to get out of there as fast as I could, but I was in the middle of nowhere. The only thing around was this little farmhouse. I made it over the farmer's fence in a split second. I didn't even look back to see how close it was. I could smell it, this awful smell. I knew it was right behind me. The farmer's dogs were yelping and howling, and I'm pounding on the door. He finally came and looked out the window, and he was mad. As soon as he caught sight of the monster, his face went white with fear. He left me out there to fend for myself. There wasn't really much I could do. I curled up in a ball and I prayed for a miracle. And then, just as quick as it came, it was gone. Back across the field, and I never saw it again. It was the most frightening experience of my life. And I found out later I wasn't the only one that had seen that creature in those woods. In fact, quite a few sightings had been reported about the same time and in the same location as my experience. Since then, I've started an organization called Bigfoot Busters, the idea being that if anybody has a sighting report of a Bigfoot anywhere, they can contact my organization and we will investigate the report. My ultimate goal is to provide undeniable, indisputable scientific proof that this thing really does exist.
Is it possible that the existence of Bigfoot can be proven? Or are the eyewitness accounts simply part of a hoax designed to draw attention to the people who tell these stories? But what if the story came from a very credible source, such as the President of the United States?
Teddy Roosevelt was a frontiersman who really enjoyed the outdoors. Before he was president in 1901, he had worked on a number of ranches in the West. During this time, he met a man named Bauman who told him a story he never forgot. Bauman was a beaver trapper. When he and his partner were trapping in a remote area of Idaho, they were attacked, apparently, by a large animal walking on 2 feet with a terrible smell and a loud howl. In addition, their lean-to was wrecked at least twice while they were out trapping. When they were attacked finally one night, they decided they should leave. But before they could get the traps all picked up and leave, the partner was actually killed with a broken neck. Apparently the story made quite an impression on Roosevelt because he chose to include it in his travel book of Western adventures. He was very impressed because apparently Bauman was quite shaken as he was telling the story, which he recalled.
Is it possible that the trapper lied about his experience? Teddy Roosevelt didn't think so. And what about Billy Riley? If his story is a fraud, why would he devote his life to proving the existence of something he never saw? And finally, were the miners on Mount St. Helens lying about the attack on their cabin? Till the day they died, none of the men ever recanted their story, despite experiencing the usual disbelief that comes with a Bigfoot sighting. Do these compelling eyewitness accounts mean that these people actually saw the elusive beast called Bigfoot? Or were their attackers all too human? Is Bigfoot just a legend, or is it a real creature? People have been debating that question for a very long time. But for those who have had a first-hand encounter, there is no doubt.
Several years ago, on the 4th of July, my sons and I went on a hike near our home in Utah. We came to a gully, and there was a strong, awful odor. As I looked around, something dark caught my eye in an aspen grove. I thought to myself, this must be the owner of the land that we're hiking on. But I wondered to myself, why is he wearing a black fur hat, a long fur coat, gloves, and boots on the 4th of July? And then it hit me. His size was about 14 feet tall, and it was so frightening that I picked up my youngest son under my arm and began to run. And I told my other sons, run to the car and don't look back. When we arrived home, my youngest, who wasn't quite 5 at the time, was trembling and ill. And I hadn't noticed in my confusion that I had picked him up facing backwards, and he had seen the creature, and he said it followed us and that it was a mommy.
A fair number of Sasquatch reports could be in error because somebody saw an oddly shaped tree trunk or formation of rocks, or a standing bear. And if they didn't notice the protruding muzzle, the narrow shoulders, and the short legs, that may have struck them as a Sasquatch. But on the other hand, someone could have seen an actual Sasquatch and assumed it was a standing bear.
There's no doubt in my mind that a number of the reported Bigfoot sightings, perhaps even the majority, are hoaxes or misidentifications. But there still remains a number of encounters that cannot be explained away so easily. This leaves us with the possibility that there is still something out there that we have yet to find.
The president of the American Board of Forensic Anthropology had this to say about Bigfoot. Either the most complex and sophisticated hoax in the history of anthropology has continued for centuries without being exposed, or the most man-like and non-human primate on Earth has managed to survive in parts of North America and remains undiscovered by modern science. If the monster we call Bigfoot actually exists, is it only in North America? Interestingly enough, Bigfoot-like creatures have been reported around the world. In the Himalayas, the Sherpa people accept as fact the existence of a creature they call the Yeti. We know it as the abominable snowman. In China and Russia, a creature called Almas that fits the general description of Bigfoot has been reported for centuries. Perhaps it's because of these legends that modern man is so willing to believe in the story of Bigfoot, even when the purported evidence turns out to be a hoax.
One of the earliest documented Bigfoot encounters was in British Columbia in the 1880s, when people on a train saw an immature Sasquatch on some rocks. They pursued it, knocked it unconscious, captured it, and took it in a baggage car to a cage where they displayed it in the nearest town. They called it Jacko. The creature was described as something of a gorilla type. It stood about 4.5 feet high, weighed 127 pounds, and was covered with long black hair. Based on this description, people thought that maybe this was indeed a young Sasquatch. But that's where the story becomes confused. Even though a description of the beast was included in the newspaper, there were no photographs and no published reports of anyone in the town ever actually having seen Jacko. Several theories have since been put forth to explain this. First, Jacko might have been shipped off to become a sideshow attraction in England. It's also possible that the showman P.T. Barnum acquired the creature, because about this time, Barnum began to exploit a very popular sideshow which he called Jojo the Dog-Faced Boy. Another possible explanation is that the whole Jacko story was dreamed up as a hoax by a newspaper in order to sell newspapers. Apparently this used to happen, and we know what happens today in the case of tabloids, and it certainly is a reason why many scientists refuse to take the Sasquatch seriously.
Then there's the story of the Minnesota Iceman. In 1968, the Society for the Investigation of the Unexplained inspected what appeared to be a fresh corpse of a large, fully haired bipedal primate preserved in ice. The owner of the specimen said it had been found floating somewhere off the coast of Siberia. Seeing an opportunity for profit, he exhibited the specimen in carnival sideshows.
Somehow, the specimen made its way to Minnesota. That's where two scientists finally got a chance to take a look at it. They saw enough to make them believe that the creature trapped in the ice was indeed real, and that was something that neither one of them had ever seen before. Their enthusiasm prompted a request to inspect the body from none other than the Smithsonian Institution. Apparently, the request was granted because in May of 1969, the Smithsonian Institution released a statement calling the Iceman a hoax. They said it was nothing more than a carnival exhibit made out of latex, rubber, and hair. Sometime after that, a Hollywood model maker came forth and claimed he had indeed made the forgery, but he also said that he had made it from the original corpse. Supposedly, the owner of the creature had decided his possession was too valuable to continue exhibiting the original, so he had arranged to have the model made. The problem is, nobody's seen the Minnesota Iceman since.
Was there some kernel of truth to the story of the Minnesota Iceman? Does the original corpse still exist somewhere? Or was the whole episode just another example of a Bigfoot hoax? Whatever it was, the story of the Iceman brings up a very good question. If Bigfoot exists, why haven't we found a body?
The vast majority of the scientific community would not be convinced of the existence of the Sasquatch until a specimen is actually produced. This could be just a skeleton or a fair number of bones, but these are not as easy to come by as a lot of people seem to think. Most animals die in one of two methods. Either they pick their place of death or they don't. Those that are killed have no choice in the matter, and we do run into their skeletons in the wild on many occasions. Those who can pick their place of death, where they think they're just ailing and they're trying to recover, they go for low places, hidden under vegetation, and when they die, they're stripped clean by other carnivores, and their bones eventually sink into the ground or get washed down into rivers, and we almost never find them. Now, I've only talked to one person who says he's found a bear that died a natural death. Well, there's at least 100 bears out there for every one Sasquatch. Bears only live half as long, so there should be 200 bear skeletons for every one Sasquatch skeleton. So it's not at all surprising that we have not found the remains of Sasquatches. It would be surprising if we did find some Sasquatch bones.
Does this mean that we may never find hard physical evidence that Bigfoot exists? Unless a specimen is actually captured, must we be satisfied with footprints and eyewitness testimony? For most scientists, the lack of a body only proves their theory that Bigfoot is indeed just a legend. But can we be sure? Are there other animals that were once thought to be a myth but have since been authenticated? And is it possible that physical evidence exists which might prove that Bigfoot is real, but science has turned a blind eye to it? In 1938, a South African fishing boat pulled in its nets and caught a piece of history. This strange-looking fish, called the coelacanth, was thought to have been extinct for millions of years. And yet, in spite of what scientists insisted to be true, the fish was obviously very much alive. Since that first amazing catch, more than 100 specimens of the rare fish have been captured. As a result, scientists have had to rethink their hard and fast beliefs about certain animal species. That doesn't mean the scientific community has lowered its standards, but it may be closing its eyes. Evidence has come to light that could lead us to the first genuine Bigfoot bone ever discovered.
The story of the Minaret skull began in 1965 on a Boy Scout expedition in the High Sierra. One of the mules that they used had gotten loose and had kicked up the bone fragment in a bog. The packer turned the skull over to a physician who happened to be in attendance as a leader, and he felt it was important enough that he ought to bring it to the attention of a pathologist and to the county officials, and this is what in fact happened. Dr. Gerald Ridge of Ventura County determined that the skull had no medical legal import, but he thought the skull was unusual enough that it should be forwarded on to some anthropologists to make some determinations about its origins. And the reason was that he wondered if it didn't represent an anthropoid species other than human. For several reasons. One was the unusual length of the skull, much longer than a normal human skull. Also, the development of a nuchal ridge, this portion of the skull that support the neck and muscles and the ligaments. The suggestion was that this creature, whatever it was that the skull came from, was very heavy and very muscular.
To solve the mystery, the bone was sent to the anthropology department of a major university in California. There it was examined by two professors of physical anthropology. They concluded that, in spite of its size and distinguishing characteristics, the skull must be that of a young, ancient Indian male. Because of their assessment, this placed the object in the category of human and ignored the possibility that it might represent an anthropoid species other than man, specifically something on the order of Bigfoot or a Sasquatch. Even though there's no direct evidence of an anthropoid species other than man on the North American continent,
there is a precedent, and that precedent is Gigantopithecus. And this was a creature that was could have been man-like or ape-like or a common somewhere in between, that stood as much as 10 feet in height if it were erect and bipedal, as we suspect it very well could have been. It very well also could have migrated to the North American continent from China and the East, as did man and many animals, and could have indeed, over the past 200,000 or 300,000 years, evolved into this creature that we today call Sasquatch or Bigfoot.
The Gigantopithecus was apparently an upright bipedal animal, being twice the body mass of a gorilla or more, 800 pounds for a male. It lived at the same time as early humans, so it wasn't in the human line, so it probably had the ape-sized brain, would have been covered with hair like any other wild primate, and we have a perfect description of a Sasquatch. I don't see that we should even call it a different species.
Bigfoot researchers who accept the Gigantopithecus theory have gone so far as to call Bigfoot North America's great ape. With this in mind, an examination of certain Bigfoot encounters reveal distinctly ape-like behavior. In British Columbia, campers have been threatened by the sounds of large animals running back and forth and tree branches breaking just inside the adjacent forest.
In most encounters between Sasquatches and humans, the Sasquatch is incredibly benign, shy and retiring. Every once in a while, there is a case where there appears to be some intimidation. The animal throws stones, branches, or rocks, and it's very, very similar to what happens with chimpanzees. The same sort of behavior when chimpanzees create this display. And it's very interesting because it sort of shows the ape-like nature of the Sasquatch.
The eyewitness accounts of the Sasquatch include characteristics that are, for the most part, normal for living primates and similar to other animals. There's nothing here that looks like a myth or a monster or any paranormal activity, and all of this lends credence to the whole idea of the Sasquatch existence.
Most disturbing, however, have been the strange howling sounds that emanate from the dark forest.
We recorded some vocalizations, which are extremely unusual. They've been studied at the University of Wyoming by Dr. Lynn Curlin. He was a professor of electrical engineering. They did a comparative analysis between human speech and the speech of other primates and of the sounds that we captured. Their conclusions are clearly in the favor of the recording's authenticity, and that the sounds truly may represent something we don't know anything about, of the likes of Bigfoot or Sasquatch.
Is this eyewitness information enough to prove that Bigfoot might be a member of the family of great apes, or maybe even an ancestor of Gigantopithecus? If so, how could such an extraordinary creature have remained hidden for so long?
In the early 1900s, a primitive-looking man named Ishi emerged from the forest near Orville, California. It turns out that he and his family were the last of a Stone Age Indian tribe that had remained hidden in a canyon only 8 miles from town. Then there's the Tatashide tribe, another Stone Age people that we had no idea existed until they were found in the jungles of the Philippines in 1971. Then there was the incident in 1977 when a Japanese trawler picked up what appeared to be a sea monster. It was partially decomposed and smelled bad, so they threw it back overboard, but not until they took some pictures. Only later, when scientists seen the pictures, they couldn't believe their eyes. It appeared to be a plesiosaurus, which was thought to be extinct millions of years ago. Today, we take it for granted that any well-stocked zoo will have a gorilla on display. 100 years ago, that idea would have been preposterous.
The fact that the mountain gorilla remained a mystery to man for so many years gives hope to those who believe in the Bigfoot legend. But it's not only the faithful followers that acknowledge that the creature might be real.
The Washington Environmental Atlas, which was published by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, actually includes a description of the Sasquatch in it. Although it doesn't say that the Sasquatch exists, it gives a description of an animal 8 to 12 feet tall, weighing up to 1,000 pounds, taking steps up to 6 feet, all things which we've heard from other reports. So it's kind of interesting that they have left the door open for this discovery. And I think it's also interesting that as we continue to move ahead, study the animal, do research, that I think the conclusive evidence is becoming nearer rather than further away.
Are we on the brink of uncovering hard evidence that would prove the existence of Bigfoot? And if such evidence were brought forward, would the scientific community take it seriously? Or if supermarket tabloids printed so many ridiculous stories about the creature that science will never accept it? The fact is that the legend of Bigfoot has become so tainted, it may be up to the average man to find it and prove its existence to the world. But where is Sasquatch? And how can we prove that the myth is a reality? Seeing is believing, and what you're about to see is the most convincing evidence of Bigfoot's existence that has ever been brought to light. October 20th, 1967, Bluff Creek, California. Two men, Roger Patterson and Robert Gimlin, set out on horseback into the remote wilderness area. Their goal, to investigate the site where hundreds of large and unidentified footprints had recently been found. Instead, they came face to face with a Sasquatch. Patterson and his partner Robert Gimlin got the surprise of their lives when they came around a bend in the creek. There, squatting on a sandbar, they saw what appeared to be a female Bigfoot. Patterson's horse was so startled by the Sasquatch that it reared back, throwing its rider to the ground. Patterson was able to grab his camera and began running toward the creature, shooting film as he ran. When the cameraman came to a standstill, the creature looked back over its shoulder and provided the world with its first glimpse at the face of a legend.
The Patterson film is important for a lot of reasons. The most obvious is because it becomes much more difficult for someone to say a creature does not exist when you got film footage of it walking in a sandbar in Northern California.
Once Patterson had the film developed, he felt certain that members of the scientific community would have to accept it as proof of Bigfoot's existence. But he was wrong. Only a handful of scientists showed any interest in the film, and those who viewed it promptly pronounced it a fake. But does the film deserve such harsh treatment? Or are the scientists simply too afraid to investigate its authenticity?
Many people have expressed opinions on the film that Roger Patterson made in 1967 of a Sasquatch in Northern California. Unfortunately, most of these people don't know anything about human biomechanics. One outstanding exception is Dmitry Donskoy in Russia, who studied the film, and I've also talked to him about it. And he's quite adamant that it is an extremely large animal, moves in a ponderous manner that is totally inconsistent with any human locomotion. Another expert was Donald Grieve in London, whose opinion was that if it was filmed at 16 or 18 frames a second, it moved in a non-human manner, but at 24 frames a second, it moved like a small man moving very rapidly. When Patterson finished his filming, he assured anyone who would listen to him that he noted that the setting was for 18 frames a second. Well, I assumed that was correct, and I did some studies comparing the pendulum swing of arms of different lengths, and concluded that if it was filmed at 24 frames a second, the creature could be a little more than 4 feet tall. At 18 frames a second, it was about 6 feet tall. At 16 frames, it would be over 7 feet tall. Well, further investigation showed that the camera that Roger was using actually does not have an 18-frame setting. It goes from 16 to 24. A gentleman with BBC got a camera of the same type and electronically timed how many frames per second it worked at. And he set it at 16, and he found it was doing 19 frames a second. Now, I concluded at 18 frames, I got a walking stature of 6 feet tall.
When the Patterson film came to light, a well-known investigator named John Green decided to take it to the experts down at Disney Studio in Southern California. to find out their opinion on how it could have been duplicated without the animal being real. They failed to come up with a logical explanation of how it could have been done. And with all the facilities they had at their disposal, you would think that if anybody could have proven it to be a hoax, they could have. Roger Patterson was a rancher and a part-time rodeo buff. He couldn't have perpetrated a hoax like this either.
Aside from the compelling evidence provided by the Patterson film, the most plentiful clues to Bigfoot's whereabouts undoubtedly come in the form of footprints. In an effort to document the evidence left behind at a Bigfoot sighting, plaster casts of these footprints are often made. Many of these casts end up in the office of Jeff Meldrum, a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Idaho State University.
I first became actively involved in the investigation into the existence of Bigfoot some 4 or 5 years ago, when I had the opportunity to examine firsthand a line of fresh footprints near the Umatilla Forest outside of Walla Walla, Washington. Well, the footprints were about 14 inches long and about 5 inches across. There was quite a number of footprints in this trackway, about 35 to 40 prints in all. And the positions of the toes and other dynamic signatures of the foot were very consistent with the walking speed and with the contours of the ground. And they contrasted with other tracks in that same line of footprints, showing a lot of spontaneity and variation from step to step. This level of detail would be rather difficult to fabricate without an in-depth knowledge of not only the functional anatomy of the human foot, but that of non-human primate feet as well. Perhaps one of the most significant details evident in these footprints was the presence of unusual flexibility at the mid-tarsal joint. This is very uncharacteristic of a human footprint. In the human foot, the stiff arch causes the foot to flex here at the ball in such a fashion. In non-human primates, apes in particular, the midfoot is much more flexible. The arch is flat, and flexibility occurs at the mid-tarsal joint. This is the kind of movement that's indicated in the footprints associated with Bigfoot. Based on the numerous footprints that I've examined over the past several years, it's evident that the Sasquatch foot is characterized by being flat and very flexible in contrast to the human foot. This is actually an adaptation that's well suited to the habitat in which it occupies here in the rugged mountains of the Pacific Northwest. In collecting these footprint casts, a number of compelling discoveries have been made. For example, the tracks of the same animal have been found at different locations. What's more, these tracks were documented by different people who were completely unaware of each other's activities, and the time between their findings was up to 7 years. In some instances, footprints display deformity, as evidenced by these bulges known as bunionettes. From the many footprints that I've examined to date emerges a model of foot anatomy that is both consistent and yet quite distinct from that of the human foot. One has to ask, who has the little black book that teaches everyone to fake these footprints so consistently?
Jeff Meldrum's footprint evidence has attracted a lot of attention from newspaper reporters, television producers, and most significantly from a Texas fingerprint expert named Jimmy Chilcutt. Highly regarded by agents of the FBI, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and state and local law enforcement, Chilcutt is one of the few fingerprint experts who's developed an expertise in non-human primate prints. In other words, he's amongst a handful of people worldwide who can tell the difference between a print left by a human and one left by a primate. Armed with this special knowledge, Chilcutt contacted Jeff Meldrum and asked for permission to examine the footprint casts. His investigation led him to a surprising conclusion.
I contacted Dr. Meldrum up at Idaho State University and explained my expertise as a primate fingerprint expert. Asked if I could examine the castings that he had, and when I did examine those castings, I found something that surprised even me. On this cast in 1967 in Northern California, the ridges flow lengthwise down the side of the foot. Human ridges flow across the foot. There's no way that this cast could be that of a human being. I also examined another cast that was cast 15 years later and hundreds of miles away. This cast displayed the same ridge texture and pattern flow as the Northern California cast. The evidence from these casts indicates that these prints were left by an unknown primate, one that we have not fully documented or that we fully understand.
Until recently, footprints and a few handprints were the only clues that Bigfoot had ever left behind to keep the mystery alive. But in September of 2000, all that changed. In a mud wallow near Mount Adams, Washington, researchers found what they believed to be the first clear body imprint of a Sasquatch.
While on the Skookum expedition, sponsored by the Bigfoot Field Research Organization, we attempted to lure in a Sasquatch using pheromones, sound, and food. What we found at one of the food drops was an impression in mud that appears to be a Sasquatch that laid down and reached over to grab that food. A forearm, wrist, hand area, the buttock, the hip, the thigh, the knee, heel, and Achilles tendon.
From the impression left in the mud, it would appear the Sasquatch was lying on its side as it reached into the center of the wallow to obtain some fruit that was left by the researchers as bait. The proportions of the imprints are all 50% bigger than a 6-foot-tall man. That's much taller than any man that I know of. The cast presents us with significant and compelling new evidence for the existence of Sasquatch. It's by no means definitive proof, but I'm hoping that in its novelty, it will stimulate further scientific investigation.
This expedition collected the type and amount of evidence that in a court of law would prove Sasquatch's existence. But for the scientific community, no way.
Hair samples were collected from the body imprint in Washington. These tiny but crucial pieces of evidence were sent to a biomedical research scientist in Oregon for identification. His conclusions? Most of the hair samples collected at the scene came from common forest animals such as elk, deer, and coyotes. But one hair sample did not. Tests concluded on this piece of evidence can tell us only this: it belongs to a primate from an unknown species. And so the search for Bigfoot continues. But let's assume that someday the existence of this mysterious creature will finally be verified. What then? It's impossible to say just what the future holds. But if the destructive ways of humans give us any clue, it might be better for Bigfoot to remain a legend, at least for now.